Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Blythe Street. As is customary, we begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome Shashank Joshi, Defence Editor for The Economist, who I'll introduce more formally in just a moment. But I'd like to frame our conversation today by offering a cautionary thought, if you like. You're all here today, I think, because warfare, violence organised by political entities to further their objectives, is an unusually prominent topic right now. I don't need to go into the reasons, we're about to discuss many of them. Our government routinely tells us that, quote, Australia faces the most complex and challenging strategic environment since the Second World War, unquote. But one of Australia's great foreign policy thinkers, Owen Harries, warned us against what he called the parochialism of the present. Sometimes that's also called recency bias, and it's a tendency that we all share to rely on evidence that comes most readily to mind. And right now we don't have to look very hard for evidence that this is a world at war and that things might get worse before they get better. And that's why it's so useful for us to hear from an analyst who is both steeped in the events of today, but who also has the ability to stand back and examine onrushing events for their deeper historical significance. So on that note, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Shashank Joshi, who's the Economist Defence Editor. Prior to joining the Economist in 2018, he served as a Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and was a Research Associate at Oxford University's Changing Character of War program. He's published books on Iran's nuclear program, on India's armed forces, and he's written for newspapers and journals around the world and appeared on radio and television, including here on Australia on the ABC regularly. He holds degrees from Cambridge and Harvard, where he served as a Kennedy Scholar from Britain to the United States. Welcome, Shashank Joshi.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. I was last year, I think, as I mentioned, 14 years ago over there in the corner for a conference on new voices, and I think I spoke on India, China, and back then I was very grateful to be described as a new voice, and now I'm very glad to be here as I hurtle towards middle age. Not so, yes, indeed, not so new anymore. Some of us hurtling past it.
Shashank, let's start in Europe, where we see in Ukraine a strange mixture of World War I style trench warfare and various kinds of emerging technology, most prominently drones. What are you learning from Ukraine about the nature of modern warfare?
Well, first of all, your disquisition on modern war and World War I has prompted me with my poppy on. I just recalled I'd forgotten it. So we could talk all day about this, lessons. There's pages and pages of lessons from this. I think I'd just pick a few out. We are thinking about long wars again, right? Not just quick, short, sharp knockout blows, but long, protracted campaigns. And it's very, very clear that your society here in the UK, us in Europe, we took a holiday from that idea. We eroded our defence industrial bases, we ran them down. We didn't think about replenishment of second and third echelons in armies. What happens when your regular professional army is chewed up and worn out? How do you replace it? What's the training pipeline? What's the equipment pipeline? What are your reserves? What's your domestic resilience? So we're thinking about protracted wars again. That's just crucial with all the things that goes into that. Food supply, domestic power generation, domestic morale. I know that in Europe, we're all looking to the Finns in Finland, who have such a long record of orienting their society for serious long campaigns, building bunkers, teaching society about the importance of domestic security and resilience. So we're all learning from that. The other really important thing is that these wars are not about the army you start with or the armed forces you begin with, right? And you can have fantastic equipment, fantastic tanks. I remember when the first American precision-guided, GPS-guided missiles went into Ukraine, roughly spring, middle of 2022. These were GPS-guided rockets launched by American HIMARS launchers. They did a fantastic job. They chewed up Russian barracks, depots, logistics. They hammered the Russian army. They facilitated Ukraine's lightning counteroffensives in late 2022. And then what happened? The Russians adapted. The interception rate spiked. And 1 in every 5, 1 in every 6 of these rockets was getting through. Same story with Excalibur artillery, GPS-guided artillery rounds. Same story with drones. And I could tell you story after story of advanced Western drone manufacturers. And I say to the Ukrainians, how's their product? Is it any good? And I'm told we couldn't take it out the box. It just didn't work. We left it in there. The jamming was too severe. And what this comes down to is adaptation. The ability not just to have a great weapon system on day one, but the ability to have the skills, the agility, the institutions to take it off the field, take the guts out, replace the radios, replace the antenna, replace the sensors, and have something that within 2 or 3 weeks might be inside a different weapon. And if we, this is UK, Australia, allies, can't do the same kind of thing, we'll be in very serious trouble.
So part of what you've described there is warfare as a whole of society, whole of nation enterprise, rather than, I think we've in the era of professionalised armed forces, we've gotten used to the idea in Western societies of military issues and of warfare being essentially divorced from the nation and from the public. But that's not what the Ukraine war is telling us. So I wonder, and that's actually a very 20th century idea as well, a kind of warfare as an industrial as well as a social enterprise. So I wondered then where you stand on an issue that I see debated regularly about the Russia-Ukraine war and the imbalance of industrial forces on both sides. So there are plenty of historical examples where the weaker side has actually won.
Yeah.
The Americans have suffered from that in the second half of the 20th century, in Iraq, in Vietnam, for instance, in Afghanistan. But we are now, I think, more often told that because the war in Ukraine is such an industrial enterprise that ultimately the bigger team, the bigger side will win, the side with more population that can produce more weapons and that can send more soldiers to the front. Where do you stand on that?
So I think in the 90s, you remember this very popular idea of a revolution in military affairs, right? The idea that American satellites, sensors, IT technology, GPS-guided weapons would mean an era of kind of everything would look like blitzkrieg. And the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, and America's stunning victory over Iraq at far lower casualties than even the Americans thought would be possible, seemed to push that idea along. And what we've seen, I think, is that in some cases at least, technology does work. It does mean a kind of highly effective for precision warfare. If you look at Ukraine, the ability to connect up your drones with your artillery systems using rapid digital networks means you can get a 40% saving in shells. That's enormous, right? 40% saving in shells. That has logistics implications. It means that you can eke your arsenal out much further. Having said that, it doesn't make a difference if the other side has 2 or 3 times more shells. So the mass is still fundamentally important, even if the technology is. And what we're seeing today is that manifest very, very clearly indeed. Earlier this year, the Ukrainians were outgunned about 5 or 6 to 1 shells on the battlefield. Now it's down to 2 to 1. But as I said to you earlier, North Korea has just provided what is officials tell me is an estimated 3 million or so shells to the Russian side, which is a doubling of Russia's own productive capacity. What is Europe making? Well, at the beginning of this year, Europe congratulated itself on being able to produce about 1 million shells a year. Now, of course, if you look across the allied defence industrial base, if you include South Korea, Australia, and other like-minded countries, then of course, we make a lot of shells, we make a lot of weapons. But on our own terms, as Europeans, that failure to recognise 18 months ago, 2 years ago, that we are exactly in a war in which, despite all the technology, that underlying mass is still vital, that failure has put us in a position where we are unable to support the Ukrainians in a way that matches our lofty rhetoric. And that, I think, is pretty shameful.
And it's not necessarily a question of GDP, is it? Because European GDP alone, if you even exclude the United States, is roughly 10 times that of Russia. What matters is how much you can produce.
Well, for partly is how much of your national wealth are you willing to allocate to this? Russia spends about 8% of GDP on defense. It starves the civilian economy. About sort of 40% of the federal Russian budget spent on defense. Our societies could never do any such thing other than in extreme, existential wars, I think. Russia doesn't mind pulling 30, 40,000 people out of the civilian economy each month and feeding them into a meat grinder in Ukraine. So that all helps. But it isn't just about that. It's about, for example, having the factories and skills capable of producing things in a crisis. So in World War II, as you know very well, what were the factories producing our aircraft, in our tanks, in our weapon systems? These were in many cases repurposed civilian factories. What has happened to our civilian manufacturing base in the UK and in Europe in the last 25 years? Could we still do that kind of thing? No. The final thing to note is it's not a problem you can just chuck money at, right? It takes years to do this and fix this. So that's a time lag. And finally, there are individual bottlenecks. Shells. We can say, let's produce 1 million more shells. Well, you might have the metal, you might have the factories, the industrial output. Have you got the energetics and the explosives to put in them, which depend on nitrocellulose that may exist only in certain key areas? And suddenly everyone wants it at the same time, just as they wanted PPE during the pandemic. No. And we're seeing the same dynamic with drone parts. It turns out the entire drone supply chain for components that Ukraine and Russia are both reliant on comes from where? Well, you guessed it, China. And this turns out to be not so great when China is heavily leaning on one side of that conflict.
Now, just finally on Ukraine, before we move on to other topics, you mentioned North Korea. So I just wanted to get your views on North Korea's most recent intervention in terms of the troops that it has sent to Russia. What do you make of that? 10,000 is not on the scale of this conflict, is not a massive contribution. Why are they doing this? What's the motivation?
So to put that in context, Russian casualties are running dead and wounded to about 1,200 to 1,500 a day. And by the way, that's not just a figure that Western officials put out for public consumption. It's a true internal assessment that they believe. Ukrainians reckon about 50,000 Russian dead in the year to October. And so in that context, Sam, you're right to say, what difference does 10,000 troops make? Well, it compounds the Russian advantage in the east on manpower, which is their principal advantage right now over Ukraine, and it frees up the Russians to go east because the North Koreans will handle the Kursk front. And by the way, this Russian army is a heavily degraded Russian army. It's lost its best officers. It's lost its best recruits. It is incapable of fighting at above the level of small platoons. There's none of this sort of fancy combined arms stuff going on here. It's small, little, tiny detachments of 6, 7 men on motorbikes taking advantage of massive artillery and glide bomb fire. North Korea, we may mock it as a kind of, tin pot dictatorship in a banana republic. But as you know, a country that devotes 25, 30% of its GDP on defense is going to come up with something. And its forces are reasonably capable at some basic level relative to the Russians. Now, why are they doing it? And here's a real problem. It's a transactional trade. And we know that they have at least asked the Russians for various sorts of defense technology. That includes SSBN technology, space launch in ways that would further their missile program, and miniaturization of nuclear weapons for tactical nuclear weapons that we know the North Koreans are super interested in. Will they get all of this? Probably not. But what they will get is two things. Diplomatic cover. 10 years ago, the Russians joined Western sanctions on North Korea. We will never see that again. Those days are gone. And secondly, they will get some portion of that defense technology, and the result is going to be a Northeast Asia that is considerably more dangerous in a few years' time.
Yeah. Well, let's move to Asia then, and in particular to China, which I'd like to talk about. Australia, as you know, is now embarking on a long and very costly effort to essentially reinvent its defence force to face the challenge of a rising China. And people here, many of whom read your column, will see in a few days, I think, a new column from you about military modernisation in China. Well, what are some of the conclusions you make about that effort?
Let me preface this by saying that I'm I think it's very important to learn from our mistakes. And I'm going to be the first to acknowledge that I read the Russian army wrong in February 2022. And I think often about why I read it wrong and what we learned from that experience. And I think one of the lessons is you've got to look at intangibles. You've got to look at the things you are not always manifest in numbers, parades, platforms. And with the Chinese, we have a knowledge gap when it comes to critical areas like logistics, which is so fundamental, especially in a cross-strait amphibious scenario. But also things like jointness. How are they good at pairing their forces across the Army, Navy, and Air Force? They're getting better at it, but still some questions. And then, of course, on top of that, political control and the Communist Party's ability to give the latitude to the People's Liberation Army to fight as they need to fight. Those are big questions, and I'm going to say, we don't know the answers to those. And while I'm here this week, it's one of the things I'd like to learn from Australian officials and others on their assessments of these things. Having said all that, the assumption has been the Chinese are bringing quantity. They're bringing mass, more ships, more missiles, more air defense launchers than we have. I think what we are now seeing in our assessments of the PLA is that quality is rising as well. Quality is rising as well. The US Office of Naval Intelligence says the quality of Chinese warships is in some cases reaching parity with Western ones, which I don't think is a conclusion that everyone has completely internalized. They're not just building knockoffs. They're not building these sort of cheap, terrible warships. In many cases, we discussed the Renhai-class destroyer. This is bigger, more capable than almost any Western equivalent warship, probably one of the leading such hulls in the world anywhere. Innovation in terms of the Zoo-class submarine propulsion designs. In hypersonics, American experts, American officials acknowledge the Chinese are ahead thanks to sustained, focused investments. I think they have about 18 wind tunnels they've been using. The Americans have sort of taken a holiday. And there are some areas where the unmanned combat aerial vehicles, where the US Air Force, for various dull bureaucratic reasons, simply has sort of taken its eye off the ball. In all of those areas, and the last one, Sam, I'll mention is the PLA Air Force, where not just they're not just getting better at building engines, they're not just getting better at building jet planes. Some of them, of course, copied from American designs and thanks to industrial scale IP theft. But also look at their air-to-air missiles. These are now pretty much on parity with NATO standard missiles. The PL-15, the standard challenging, is a standard benchmark driving American capability. The PL-17, which is designed to go very, very long range, target things like airborne command posts, AWACS in the rear, that's one of the longest ranged air-to-air missiles we see anywhere in the world. And with the caveat that we don't know what's in the sort of secret black programs that America develops, I think the days are over where we can say the PLA is a low technology, high quantity force. Those assessments must now change.
Yeah. Now, of course, all of that feeds into Australian judgments that Australian governments have been making over the last few years about the kind of environment that Australia faces, the international environment that the Australian Defence Force faces, and it's fed into judgments, policy decisions such as Orcus. And so I want to ask you, Shashank, about the state of Orcus, particularly from a UK perspective, which has such a critical role in the third phase of the submarine acquisition. It's worth prefacing this by saying that I think you could roughly divide Australia's Orcus critics into two schools. One is the group you might call the strategic skeptics, who are those, and I would number myself amongst them, who say Orcus is a bad idea for strategic reasons. We can do this better and cheaper in other ways. That's a minority group in Australia, it has to be said. The second group is the one I would call the pragmatic skeptics. And these are people who say, no, actually, nuclear-powered submarines are a great idea. Australia should be doing this. However, it's so difficult, this project of actually building them and buying them, buying some from overseas, building some here, is going to be so difficult that it's never going to happen. And I would say that pragmatic skeptics school is actually in the majority in Australia among our strategic commentators and among observers. And a big part of that scepticism rests on the fact that there are real doubts about the capacity of the UK industrial base to actually deliver the Orcus-class submarines that we are going to want. What's your response to all that?
It's a really fascinating debate. It's one I hope to sort of be steeped in a bit more this week, actually, Sam. But I think, let me start by saying I'm not starry-eyed about UK naval capability in the defence space. I just wrote a piece a few weeks ago on the parlous strait of the Royal Navy being stretched, particularly the submarine force. We're seeing SSBN, so these are nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines, which go at sea, one at sea at all times, continuous at sea deterrence in the North Atlantic, for ever longer patrols, which are now getting into 6-7 month periods. And every time they come back, we have a class of people that says, well done, incredible sailors, what a great Navy we have that they can do 7-month patrols. And I think, no, this is a sign of complete failure that you're doing 7-month patrols. This is terrible for morale, it's terrible for the hulls, and it's a symptom of underlying problems in our ability to maintain these boats. Similarly with SSN patrols, attack submarines, these have the opposite, these have the opposite problem. They're not at sea enough. Availability rates are shocking, and we're hardly getting these at sea because of all the problems. So I'm not starry-eyed about it. Having said that, I'm less worried about the implications of this for Orcus for a few reasons. One of them is, first of all, we have no safety net. It's SSN Orcus or it's the end of our naval ambitions. That's it. There is no backup plan to revert to in which we can screw over the Australians on this. If SSN Orcus doesn't happen, this is the central plank of our future naval capability. The second point is we're in the middle of a defence review, a strategic defence review. One, by the way, which is looking very carefully at the Australian experience for the last 18 months in your review as well. And indeed, one of the authors of that review is the High Commissioner in London, of course, and so very fortuitous for us. And that review, although it'll be drafted by the end of the year at some stage, we don't know exactly what it'll say, the general mood is that it may well accentuate air and maritime capabilities over heavy ground forces in Europe. And the paradox we're sort of squaring with, we can discuss this more, is the government wants to have a policy of NATO first. That's the guideline they've set. And yet they want to do that in a way, or some people want to do that in a way that isn't necessarily saying, let's just double down on heavy divisions sitting there in Estonia. How do we be more creative about this, more flexible capabilities with more emphasis on the one area? If you pick one area where the UK had the biggest military advantage over its adversaries, particularly Russia, submarines would be top of that list. And so submarine forces will be very heavily prioritised, I suspect. And the last point is money is going into the shipyards, but also into the maintenance infrastructure now in substantial amounts, fixing some of the problems that led to this point. So for all those reasons, I'm a little bit less worried that SSN Orcus is going to turn into a huge debacle. I think that the bigger problem for us, this is not a problem for you, it's a problem for us, is that the effort we will undertake in making sure that Orcus happens and that the nuclear enterprise functions as it should, by which I mean, the subs, the reactors, or everything else, and the other bits that are non-negotiable, nuclear weapons, but also our GCAP program for the future sixth-generation warplane, which we're building with the Japanese and the Italians and others. The resources and the attention on that will have knock-on effects on our conventional military forces in so many other areas, but that isn't your problem.
No, that's kind of our problem too. There are credible estimates out there that AUKUS is going to end up devouring the entire naval shipbuilding budget. So that is definitely a problem we face in the future. The big bills have not come due yet for AUKUS. That's several years away. But I was interested, by the way, in your in that NATO first slogan that the new UK government has adopted. That, on its face, would put paid to any notion of the UK being any kind of Indo-Pacific power, as fanciful as I thought that was even under the previous government. But for instance, the previous Tory government had committed to being part of the submarine rotational force in Western Australia. Do you see that going ahead under this government, or is that in question now?
Honest answer, I don't know, but given what I've said about the availability of attack submarines, it's going to be, let's put it this way, a huge lift to ensure that we have a permanent rotational presence coming out of Perth from 2027, I think it is, given the commitments in the North Atlantic, given the pressure on the submarine force. And if it does happen, I kind of shudder to think what is the knock-on effect on our commitments in sweeping the sea lanes for Russian submarines, because these submarines also have a role in protecting our ballistic missile nuclear submarines. So this is a huge challenge. But I do want to say a word on that broader point about the UK's specific ambitions. I think the consensus, particularly in the last, you look at our foreign policy review of 2023, which was the IR refresh, the integrated review refresh. It said the Indo-Pacific tilt has been achieved. So it was a kind of declaration of victory, saying we're not sending vast naval flotillas east. We are still sending the carrier strike group to the Indo-Pacific next year. There are 2 OPVs, offshore patrol vessels in Asia. But there is no great ambition to vastly change or increase the military deployment element of this. Yeah. I think what people are focusing on is the defence industrial side, so looking at Orcus, particularly Pillar 2, by the way, also GCAP, saying these defence industrial collaborations with Indo-Pacific powers are part of the tilt. And by the way, North Korea's entry into the war, I think, is reviving a conversation about deepening ties with South Korea as well. But in addition to that, it's about how do we think about the connections between the Indo-Pacific and Europe in ways that go beyond just which ships are where. So for instance, how do we do more consultation and thinking about what is a role for the UK and for Europeans in a war over Taiwan, in economic deterrence? And I think that stuff, all of those conversations are as much part of our Indo-Pacific thinking now as the military piece here.
Yeah. Yes, so the UK carrier battle group will still make its tour, but we can't simply hope that if the Chinese are planning anything, that they wait until the British carriers in the South China Sea.
And indeed, what's clear to us now is, we are seeing a world in which North Korea, Iran, Russia, China are more aligned than previously, whether you want to call it an axis or whether you believe it is a more loose alignment of transactional interests. This question, in the UK, the officials are calling it adversary alignment, is a huge preoccupation. And what it means is that in a world in which you have a serious war over Taiwan, it is also very potentially one in which Russia sees opportunities for exploiting America's distraction in absence in Europe, and in which European military assets and resources will be heavily in demand and tied down in our region, but also potentially in the Middle East, in the Indian Ocean, in so many other places. And I think there's no real sense that we will be providing major military capability in the Western Pacific. But I still continue to think there's a range of useful things that we might be doing well short of that benchmark.
So I'm going to open it up to all of you in just a moment. But before I do that, so please have your questions ready. There'll be a mic roving around very soon. Just my final question from me is really a sort of tradecraft question for you about how you do your job. The flood of information that you now have to process from social media, from commercial satellite photos that we all see now that are far cheaper than they used to be. What do you conclude from all of that about the broader field that we call open source intelligence? Is it now so rich? Is there now so much information available that the entire business model of spying has been undermined?
What about the business model of journalism as well? But I mean, this, we're in the same business, aren't we? Gathering non-public information and talking about it to people, just different audiences. I want to just tell a short story on that. Back in the 90s, America had synthetic aperture radar satellites. Some of you may know what these are, some of you may not, but they're satellites that don't see in the visible light spectrum. They see by actively sending radar pulses to the ground, which means they can see at night without illumination, and they can see through foliage or other things like that. America didn't acknowledge that these existed in the 1990s. They were so heavily classified. Not only could you not say where they were or what they did, the very existence was a state secret until the late 1990s. Now, you and I can buy these things at relatively, I wouldn't say low, but kind of, manageable cost. And back in April, Iran bombed Israel with a barrage of missile strikes, the biggest ever barrage of missile strikes we've ever seen. Israel retaliated by taking out an Iranian radar. And I was speaking to someone who did this for a living and who said, I've got something interesting to show you. And they showed me a picture that was commercial. It wasn't classified, but it was a picture of the radar, Iranian radar on the ground. And they said, that's a target engagement radar. It's called a cheese board radar for a Russian-made S-300 system. And I said, oh, so the Israelis didn't hit it? And he said, oh, no, they did. I was like, well, that's a radar right there. And he said, isn't that fine? He said, no, they've moved a different radar onto that spot to make it look like the Israelis didn't hit anything. And I said, oh, well, so does that mean the system's working fine again? And he said, no, this radar doesn't work with the system. They've just stuck it there to make it look like it's all fine. And I thought that was fascinating, right? Because it was about the theater of how states present failure or success in these things. But it was also about my ability as a journalist within a couple of days to do this exquisite battle damage assessment of an Israeli airstrike in the middle of Iran against this incredibly technical system, and to be able to see it and report on it and publicize it. And we could never have done that, 6, 7, 8 years ago. For intelligence agencies, I think the challenge is that it's an opportunity, really, as well. It means stuff that would once have been really valuable, going to the Prime Minister and saying, I've got this intelligence report. The Prime Minister can now get that from The Economist, maybe like a day or a few days later, of course. I'm not pretending that we have our exquisite national satellite assets at our disposal. But what it does is frees them up to focus on the secrets that we can't collect. And I'm always really at pains to remind readers, yes, I was able to show you pictures of Russian tanks poised in the woods of Belarus weeks before the invasion. I was able to show you, identify which Russian unit was where by talking to experts and looking at TikTok footage of tanks. What I couldn't tell you, though, is I didn't collect Putin's war plans, right? American intelligence collected Putin's war plans and leaked them. Thankfully, I didn't get those. My fellow journalists didn't get those. The CIA and the NSA and for the Five Eyes Alliance got those things. I wasn't able to tell you that the Russians were moving blood plasma to the front lines on January 22nd as a key indicator, a key tactical indicator that the invasion was going to happen. Only exquisite classified intelligence collection capabilities got those things. So there are still things only secret intelligence can do. The challenge is making sure agencies don't waste their time on the stuff that other people can do now and focus their resources on the bits where they really have value added.
Well, I'll give you another anecdote, or you guys another anecdote. I happen to follow the Chinese military, and particularly its naval capabilities, very closely. And it just so happens that one of China's biggest naval shipyards sits underneath the flight path on the way to Pudong International Airport in Shanghai. So the reason we know so much about, for instance, China's aircraft carrier program is because people take photos out of the windows of these commercial aircraft and then post them online. And these are not spies. These are not defence attaches.
Most of them aren't, anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. These are proud Chinese nationalists who happen to be military enthusiasts. Yes. Who want to show off, who essentially want to display their country's military prowess to the world, and are in effect creating a kind of, offering insights into the military, which in a previous generation, for instance, in the old Soviet days, spies would have risked their lives to get.
Yes. Yes.
So let's open it up to all of you guys. Can I have your hands, please? And if you could offer a question rather than a long statement, I'd be very grateful. So let's start at the very back there, Rach.
How significant is the supply of drones from Iran to Russia for their use in the Ukraine battle? Because my understanding was that Iran's supply of drones was just as significant as China's.
Do you want me to tackle that, Sam?
Please.
Yes, great. A few things. Iran provided various types of Shahed loitering munitions, which are drones that crash into their target. They're actually slightly misnamed because they don't loiter all that much. They're kind of one-way attack drones is the latest piece of military jargon, OWA. But the supply is now a little bit less important because the Russians have indigenized the production There's a big factory in Kazan where they are building these things, license producing them. And Sam, I mentioned the importance of adaptation in war, right? We're seeing the Russians do this, regrettably. They're taking these drones and they're making them better. For example, Ukrainians have a fantastic network of acoustic air defense sensors. They pick up the sound of the motors of these, the high-pitched whine of these drones. So not relying on expensive radars, but relying on this distributed sound sensor network. There's, some antecedents from World War II, actually. And what the Russians doing in their factory is saying, okay, let's shield the motor with acoustic dampening to make it less noisy, and then try that. And then they iterate, and they try it, see how it goes, and then go back to the factory, change it again. That's what we ought to be doing with our defense industrial base, right? Rapid iteration in response to events. And so my point is that supply is a bit less important. However, the Iranian missile supply to Russia is important, particularly ballistic missiles, which is why, whatever else one thinks about the merits or otherwise of Israeli activity in the region, the impact of the latest Israeli airstrikes on Iran's missile production capacity is probably going to have a beneficial knock-on effect to Ukraine by having taken out a number of missile production sites, rocket motor sites, storage sites. And I suspect that will make life quite difficult for the Iranians, because they'll have to hold back more of the stock for themselves, and they can't supply the Iranians. On the Chinese, you mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese are not, to our knowledge, providing full-blown lethal weapons to the Russians right now. There are some indications there may be one drone that is in production. It's not clear, actually, from what I understand, that this is a full-blown weapon system that is being done with Chinese knowledge. But by and large, the Chinese have stopped short of providing lethal weapon systems to the Russians. What they are providing is massive amounts of dual-use aid. They are the critical enablers of Russia's defense industry.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just keep coming down the line here, Rach?
Shashank, thank you for a brilliant, brilliant talk. My name is Saeed. I'm a recovering diplomat. My question to you, I was going to ask you about the tit-for-tat between Israel and Iran. I'll ask you this instead. You have a front row seat into humanity at its worst. How do you switch off so that you're able to enjoy a sunset, if at all?
What a great question. I mean, it's so interesting because we are in this world of, you talked about people posting videos of the Chinese shipyards. We're in a world where people post snuff videos on social media every day because we have unmediated, raw, visceral footage of not only of the war, but also of our weapons now record all of their engagements, right? Our weapons record their engagements. And I remember reporting on a first-person view FPV drones, which are flown by pilots with goggles. They're racing drones. And a picture of what they not only record their kills, but observer drones also sit back and record a third view of the kill. And I remember seeing a video of a drone chasing a Russian soldier around a tank who was hiding, circling it, spiraling in as he ran in futile fashion. And I thought it was horrific. Whatever we think about the kind of horror of the Russian invasion, these are still kind of often young people fighting, to their death. And, I'm wearing a poppy, and these things commemorate those who have died on all sides in war. They don't just commemorate our own dead, certainly in the context of the British dead in World War I and II and the Commonwealth dead. And in that context, I think there is a real risk of sort of a loss of humanity. And I don't want to romanticize war as it has been fought in the past and suggest that there was some elevated level of humanity that there is, not today. But one way I deal with this is by not watching reams of footage of snuff movies. I leave it to those who track these things and tabulate them. I try to take a more detached kind of analytical view of this without getting caught up in it completely. So that's one way. The other thing is the occasional digital detox is very useful. I was telling Sam, I visited China for a couple of weeks for a family wedding, and I had a wonderful time. But one of the great benefits of traveling without your electronic devices is that you can no longer be glued to the news and social media. So that's another great way of I think keeping some detachment and keeping away from these things. Enforced digital detoxes.
By the way, for anyone here and to anyone watching online who is tempted to seek out these videos, I would urge you in the strongest possible terms, do not. It is not good for you. Just avoid it altogether. You'll be glad you did. Just a bit further down here on the right, Rachel.
Thank you for the great presentation. How ready is NATO for a potential Trump presidency?
I think the answer is it's not ready at all. And you could rephrase the question to ask, how ready are Europeans for a Trump presidency? I think we're currently sort of entertaining multiple scenarios in Europe. And one of them is, of course, the kind of apocalyptic scenario of Trump pulling security guarantees from Europe, diluting Article 5, pulling out troops. Most people tend to think that's relatively unlikely in the short to medium term. I think they feel what is equally the first problem we face is a Ukraine problem, right? It's not a NATO problem, it's a Ukraine problem, which is that he comes to the table and forces Ukraine to sign up to such a bad deal on pain of losing all aid that it leaves Ukraine vulnerable, weak, indefensible, and vulnerable to a renewed Russian invasion in a way that would be catastrophic. And the question is, can Europe then fill the gap in aid? The answer is no, it can't. And I've outlined some of the reasons why not. But even if we could fill the defense industrial gap, we cannot fill the gap in intelligence provision, in leadership, in the nuclear umbrella that is giving us the confidence to take quite risky steps in providing arms to Ukraine, and in so many other areas, right? This aid is being coordinated by the Americans, by European Command in Europe, in Germany. So that's step one. Ukraine and the problem of dealing with Trump policy on Ukraine is problem number one. Problem number two is, are we ready to defend ourselves? Put very simply, are we ready to defend ourselves? And you can point to any number of optimistic metrics. I think about 22 out of 32, probably roughly 20 out of 30 European NATO member states now meet the 2% target on defense. But if you talk to European military planners in SHAPE, in NATO's military command, they will say the plans drawn up by General Chris Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, over the last 2 years, for the first time since the Cold War, we have proper defense plans, right? They require closer to 3% to fight credibly and fully. And the problem we ultimately face is we're okay on some areas. We have enough men under arms. That's not the key problem right now. The problem is in all the critical enablers of fighting, Europe is substantially deficient. And the ones I would point to are air defense systems, which, as we have seen, are in high demand all around the world, right? In Israel, in Guam, in other American territories of key strategic concern. Air-to-air refueling tankers, critical for long-range strike missions, as we have just seen from Israel. Airborne command, AWACS and AEWC, early warning and control aircraft. And the one that really concerns me, by the way, really concerns me, is suppression of enemy air defense. Because we see in Ukraine what happens when you don't have air superiority and the kind of close infantry battle you are forced to enter into. And you do not want to fight that kind of battle with the Russians. You don't want to fight that. You want to have a battle in which you have air superiority, you degrade them before you get to the close battle, and you are able to operate with the kind of freedom you're accustomed to. But Europeans, we don't have the anti-radar munitions and aircrafting capability in sufficient numbers. So people always say, NATO, we wouldn't fight the Russians like Ukraine does. And that's true, but that's if the Americans are present. If the Americans are not present, then you don't necessarily have that guarantee of air superiority, and then you are into a world of trouble in so many different areas. And to cut a long answer short, investing in the areas necessary to replenish those gaps, that will take us, will occur on a timeline that will exceed a Trump term, that will exceed a Trump presidency. So we have to, there was a comment by Donald Tusk this week saying the era of outsourcing our security to is over. And my view is that the jury is out on that. We'll see. We will see.
So doesn't all of that's a sorry picture that you've painted, but doesn't all of it really serve to reinforce the argument that whatever Europeans like Donald Tusk and others might say about how important it is for Europe to get its act together because Russia is such a big threat, they don't actually believe it. They don't actually believe that the Ukraine war is that important, is that vital to European security, that they ought to be investing in the kind of ways that you're implying.
Well, Donald Tusk is probably one of the few people who can say he believes it, because his country is spending near enough 4% of GDP on defense and is going on a manic buying spree from the South Koreans and the Americans of missile launches, tanks, planes, everything, F-35. And there are other countries that are sort of getting there. But if you're asking that question of France, of Germany, of the UK, I would agree. And I think part of the answer is complacency. Ukraine has bought us time. It has degraded the Russian army. It has slowed them down. It has woken us up. But have we used that time to the maximum extent? Absolutely not. And if Ukraine, by the way, I'm very gloomy about Ukraine. I think its battlefield position is very bad right now. If Ukraine falls, or if a bad deal is foisted upon it, we will come to see how serious we were when we said that Ukraine was a vital interest for the Europeans. Right. And if we believe it, and I don't rule out this will happen, you will find that because of our failure to address these issues in the last 2 years, we could be shocked into some dramatic steps. And I mean here, suddenly raising defense spending by 2 or 3 percentage points in a short period of time. I mean putting troops into Ukraine to draw a line and stave off Russian advances. I'm not saying these will happen, but I'm saying that, that discrepancy between our perception and articulation of the stakes and our failure to invest in resource terms or risk terms in addressing it could manifest in some surprising ways within the next 6 months.
Who else has a question? We have plenty on this side here. Well, why don't we go to the gentleman in the front row first, who's been very patient.
Thank you. Can I get your opinion on Israel? Is Israel solving a problem or creating a problem?
I mean, I think it's doing both, to be honest. It's buying itself a lot of time. It has. I will, again, the spirit of kind of acknowledging our analytical errors. I did not think Israel could do what it has done to Hezbollah without facing much more severe repercussions. I was convinced that a war on this scale between Israel and Lebanon would involve much more substantial missile attacks on Israeli cities, much heavier casualties, a loss of American support under some circumstances, and Iranian involvement in the conflict to a direct extent if they went after the Hezbollah leadership. What have they done? They have taken out Nasrallah. They have decimated the entire leadership of Hezbollah. They have degraded its missile stockpiles to down perhaps to a fifth of the pre-war stockpiles, if you believe Israeli estimates, and I'm not sure I do, but that's the claim. And they have done, and they have gone into southern Lebanon. They have flattened southern Lebanon. What they have done there is create a buffer zone by smashing through villages, woodlands, burning it down to create open fields of fire, fields of visibility, in ways that actually make some of the southern Gaza destruction look quite mild in the Philadelphia corridor. So they've done all of that. But what's incredible is they've done it without Hezbollah being able to fight back to the extent I thought they would. So tactically, operationally, I don't think I can deny that the Israelis have achieved a major success in weakening one of their principal adversaries, and at the same time exposing Iranian weakness to an incredible extent. They have, Iran had two principal means of deterrence in the region. Its regional allied militant forces, if you want to call them proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Shia militias in Iraq. Israel has brought Hamas to its knees, and I'm not saying it can't reconstitute, but it's brought Hamas to its knees, and it has decimated Hezbollah and its missiles. And the other asset was Iranian conventional missiles. And in April and again in October, it blunted those missile strikes to a very high degree. Of course, with substantial Western assistance, with substantial American assistance. And there are, we know Israeli interceptors may be running out, there are problems, but it has done all of that incredibly successfully. Now, what's the cost? Well, obviously, the grave, appalling humanitarian cost, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, cannot be discounted. But more than that, I worry profoundly that we are now headed into an era in which Iran is much more likely to seek nuclear weapons. And I think there is, after I've followed Iran, I wrote a book on Iran's nuclear weapons when I was at RUSI 10 years ago, and I now feel it is likelier than not that by the end of the decade, the Iranian leadership will seek to pursue nuclear weapons and weaponize a program that has been in abeyance fundamentally since 2003. And just as India's nuclearization and Pakistan's nuclear tests somewhat blunted India's conventional military advantage over Pakistan by creating a nuclear shield for Pakistan. I worry that the same dynamic could be evident in the Middle East, and that a nuclear Iran could have all kinds of unforeseen and complicated consequences. And I am not convinced it can be stopped by military means, that bombing the nuclear sites will stop it. That's one. The other one is, of course, what is the long-term future of Gaza? And what emerges out of Gaza in an era, in a world in which the Israeli leadership is unwilling to countenance a serious political authority either led by the Palestinian Authority or others, and in his refusal to countenance a viable two-state solution is preventing Arab partners from making a significant contribution to that. Well, in the long run, I fear it will spawn more militancy, more violence, more desperation. Hamas in the north of Gaza is already reforming, Israel having cleared the area. So Israel may win the war but lose the peace. But actually, I'm afraid Israel's done that many times in its history, and that's the pattern that we have seen in prior Israeli conflicts.
Yeah. Rach, we've got two down here in the fourth row.
Hi, thank you. So what potential future conflict hotspots are you currently looking at? And with regards to the discussion that you were just having, does Israeli tactical success provide a template for how the West can win against this access of authoritarian countries? And do you think Western countries are looking at this as a template or not?
Well, let me address the latter first. Our problem with Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, it isn't that we don't have operational military plans and options. We can do a lot in military terms. The problem is much more complicated. One of them is nuclear weapons are important, and they change the balance of power between countries. There is a reason that we treat North Korea with such extreme caution. It is a nuclear-armed state whose arsenal is expanding dramatically in size and sophistication, and that gives its options, and we worry about that correctly, right? We correctly worry about it. Similarly, we are cautious in the sorts of, the debate we're having now over whether to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with Western-supplied long-range missiles. It is a reasonable and legitimate debate to have. I am not sympathetic to people who say escalation is a totally fictional concern, because it is not. I'm in favor of easing restrictions, but I say that from the full knowledge that I'm accepting a high level of risk, and our ability to bomb North Korea, to bomb Russia, to expand covert operations in these countries, to do surgical strikes like the Israelis have. These are all political problems. They're not military ones. They're to do with the level of risk, escalation risk you are willing to accept. And to give you one example of that, we provided long-range missiles to Ukraine, in my opinion, rightly so, but many people in the Pentagon were shocked when Russia began, GRU, Russian military intelligence officers, began turning up in Yemen, providing targeting assistance to the Houthi rebel group bombing ships in the Red Sea, and threatening to provide advanced missiles to the Houthis. And we kind of are asking, well, how could they possibly do this? Well, that is what horizontal escalation looks like. That's what happens. You have to go into this eyes open. And similarly, if you want to start, confronting them in more aggressive ways, adversaries have options as well. So we need to think about what that escalation looks like, and that's a political problem. In response to your first question, could you remind me what it was again, very briefly?
What potential
future hotspots. Yeah, I mean, so many, but certainly, I'm trying to understand myself, having spent 2 years buried in staring at tiny little towns in Donetsk, refamiliarize myself with the landscape of Asian security flashpoints beyond Taiwan, right? And we've just had a year in which Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea and the Philippines has been at the crux of a really significant dispute. So I think there's so much more of that we need to understand. In my own part of the world, absolutely, the Sahel is a big concern, where Russian influence has supplanted French and American military influence, and the jihadist threat is resurgent in the Sahel. So we're extremely concerned about that. And I guess beyond that, we've just had a really critical election in Moldova overnight, in which it looks like the pro-Russian candidate has been defeated, but that little sort of underbelly of Europe, which is outside of NATO, very vulnerable to Russian influence, and I'm thinking here of Georgia, where we've seen huge protests in the last 2 weeks, Moldova, the Balkans. We think a lot about the Balkans. I know very far from here, but those are somewhere we in Western Europe kind of very much spend a lot of our time thinking about.
I would only add to that unhappy picture that there hasn't been a major terrorist attack in the West in many, many years now. So
that's right, yes. And of course, there was one in Moscow, of course, right? The Crocus, the terrible ISIS attack. And one of the long-term questions is that I know that Western security services are grappling with, and I'd be surprised if they weren't doing it here too, Sam, is that question of what is the long-term impact of the war in Gaza? Because a lot of terrorism we see in the West today is not straightforward jihadist ideology motive. It's mixed motive. It's people who are observing violent content. Come back to our conversation on drone strikes. Extremist, violent video imagery from multiple conflict zones. It's not about beheadings from Syria. It's about drone strikes in Russia, POWs being executed in Ukraine, about sort of the Tigray conflict, and they are being radicalized in ways that are very, very different to the Islamist radicalization of 20 years ago. And the impact of the footage coming out of Gaza and Lebanon now will, I think, have a long-term impact on some of that in ways we haven't fully understood just yet.
we have time for one and maybe two more. Let's go back to this side of the room.
If Trump wins the election, and Trump will raise tax to globally, and to China will be 60%. That will,
so he says.
Yeah. That will gradually cut the trade between China and the US. If these things happen, do you think, how about Euro? Euro will follow US or not?
Oh, that's an easy one. No. In fact, what we will see is quite bitter EU-US trade tensions, because the EU will also be subject to Trump's tariffs, right? And we saw this in his first term, and that will cast this economic shadow over the security debates that that you asked about on the NATO front, right? So we will be having a debate on Trump's protection of Europe, his expectations of Europeans on defense spending, but also divergence in key policy areas, at the same time as a major trade war is unfolding. The interesting question, I think, is less about the tariff battle, but over the specifics of economic measures on individual areas like Chinese electric vehicles, where national security concerns are now feeding back into the European debate, because the EU is following America on EV tariffs. But the short answer is, I think this economic war is going to be just as bad for transatlantic relations as it will be for U.S.-China relations. Trump is not, is geopolitically allied agnostic when it comes to some of these trade battles, as we saw in the first term with South Korea, with the Indians, with the Europeans.
Well, one more question then. This gentleman's been very patient too. I'm sorry.
We've talked a bit about conventional warfare, so the three domains, land, air and sea. What about cyber and space, in particular space? Do you see space in the future as a flashpoint strategically for the world players?
There's been a lot of debate from Ukraine over, well, where was all the cyber? And I think the problem is in our heads, we kind of expected these domains to have a decisive impact on their own. They were never decisive on their own. They were just critical enablers of all the other stuff happening. And on day one of the war, we did see Russia attempt a cyber attack on the Viasat satellite communication network that did cause problems for Ukraine. And by the way, now the Russians are having more success in electronic warfare against Starlink, which is Elon Musk's communication satellite network, which is vital to the Ukrainians. So it is making a difference. I think what we're learning is that you have to integrate these things into the rest of your operations. On the space side, this is really interesting, because I don't think Ukraine has we haven't seen a full test of these capabilities, right? Russia has not gone after the Western space assets that are enabling Ukraine's war to the fullest extent possible. It hasn't even interfered as much as it might have done. So we are probably still getting a rather cushy view of what that space domain looks like. In a sort of higher intensity conflict involving major powers directly, I think it's far more likely that we would see efforts to blind, dazzle, jam, if not necessarily kinetically destroy communication and imaging satellites. I think that's highly likely. What is interesting, though, for a long time, Sam, we were in a world in which the Americans had overwhelming dominance in space, and the Chinese sort of clear incentive in saying, well, the Americans depend on space way more than we do, and so it's a no-brainer as to whether you disable these things and you blind and disable these things. We're now in a world in which the Chinese space program is coming along, and I didn't mention this in my answer to you, but leaps and bounds, right? Leaps and bounds. They are putting hundreds of reconnaissance satellites into orbit, really advanced geosynchronous orbit, optical and radar satellites. They are increasingly aping some of those American practices of a digitized network military force that relies on a space backbone for intelligence, for communications, for so many other things. So the space domain is suddenly becoming a little bit more equitable. And the Chinese have a much more complex calculation than in the past, I think, which is actually, what does it look like if we also lose access to these things? So the interesting question we'll be grappling with in the future is, what does deterrence look like in that domain? And is it becoming easier to deter the Chinese as they themselves become more dependent on some of those space assets in the way that the Americans were previously?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us out for today. We've run out of time. Thank you all so much for coming. We'll see you again next time for the next Lowy Institute event. Keep an eye on our website for all the information you need. In the meantime, would you please thank Shashank Joshi.